Hi, here we are for part 2 of Guns for General Washington, a story of the American Revolution. We're on chapter 3, The New Commander. Father and I went down to camp along with Captain Gooding. There we saw the men and boys as thick as hasty pudding. Yankee Doodle, keep it up, Yankee Doodle dandy. Mind the music and the steps, and with the girls be handy. A ragged squad, led by a lone fifer, made its noisy way through the camp. The fife shrilled and squeaked, and the men raised their voices to follow the melody. The ditty had first been sung by the British to mock the rebels, but the colonists liked the lively tune, so they added new words and made it their own. There was Captain Washington upon a slapping stallion, giving orders to his men. I guess there was a million. Yankee Doodle, keep it up, Yankee Doodle dandy. Mind the music and the step, and with the girls be handy. The squad, on its way to gather wood, marched past the camp headquarters. An officer working at his desk stopped to listen, and the song gave him a welcome lift. George Washington had been sitting and brooding. Like General Howe, his opponent aboard HMS Somerset, Washington was worried about the stalemate, but not for the same reasons. Excuse me. Months earlier, in June of 1775, the Continental Congress had chosen him to command the new Continental Army. The delegates in Philadelphia couldn't have made a better choice. Tall, dignified, with good military experience, the Virginia landholder was a staunch patriot. When the call came, he accepted it gladly. Full of exciting plans and high hopes, he had hurried to Massachusetts by fast coach. But after a few days in Cambridge, his excitement and hopes began to fade. What the general found when he reached headquarters was something close to chaos. The Continental Army was a force without shape. There was no organization, no discipline. Shelters were scattered everywhere, no two alike. The men were living in tumble-down shacks, rickety lean-tos, or tents patched together from scraps of canvas and blankets. Their clothes were shabby, and there were no uniforms except for a few companies funded by their wealthy officers. Washington had a neat, precise military mind. Over and over he tried to remember his raw troops were colonists, not professional soldiers. They were a noisy, good-humored, democratic mob, willing and brave but not happy to be taking orders. In fact, orders and royal commands were the very things they were against. So they'd come together to put an end to the King George's tyranny. This odd assortment of farmers and fishermen, carpenters and cobblers, tradesmen and teachers, barbers, blacksmiths, frontier scouts, seamen, clerks, weavers, tanners, tailors, shopkeepers, stonemasons, lumberjacks, and young men seeking adventure. Also, the good pay of $6 a month for army privates drew many colonials to the cause. It was the easygoing disorder of his troops that troubled General Washington, but that could be corrected. These good-natured amateurs with their pitchforks and hunting rifles had to be welded into a real military force, or the cause would be lost. Yes, rules and discipline had to be established. Officers had to dress according to rank, and their orders had to be carried out. March and drill practice would be increased. Work parties would be organized. Sanitation would be improved. Washington had wanted to make soldiers of his men, and under his leadership the changes came quickly. Still, many problems remained, and the commander wasn't sure that they would ever be solved. For one thing, all the discipline in the world couldn't combat the weather. Winter was coming, and soon it would turn bitterly cold. There were thousands of troops in Cambridge, badly dressed and poorly housed. The countryside had been stripped bare and firewood was scarce. The army was short of blankets, soap, shoes, medical supplies, tools, muskets, and gunpowder. In August, Washington had been told that the arsenal held over 300 barrels of gunpowder. Later, when these figures were checked, it turned out there were only 90 barrels on hand, which meant that each man could fire his musket 8 or 9 times before the powder would be gone. What troubled the general even more was that he had no artillery. Several big siege guns hidden in Concord had been captured by the redcoats. Now there were only a few small brass cannons that could fire a 6-pound shot. Compared to Howe's weapons, they were no better than pop guns. Sitting at his desk on a cold November day, General Washington worried about all this. Outwardly, he seemed calm, but his spirits were low. Picking up his quill pen, he continued the letter he'd begun to write to his friend Joseph Reed in Philadelphia. In it, he wrote, "Could I have foreseen what I have and am like to experience, no consideration on earth would have induced me to accept this command." The general put down his pen, sealed the letter, and buttoned his coat, and he stepped outside. From the top of Prospect Hill, the very spot where Will Knox had stood earlier, he could see Boston clearly. With his pocket telescope, he could make out the red jackets of Howe's Marines drilling on the Common and patrolling Barton's Point. Like his British enemy, Washington needed a victory. On the land side, the rebels were in control, surrounding Boston in a huge ring, from Roxbury to Chelsea on the Mystic River. In manpower, they far outnumbered the British, but the British had all the gunpowder and all the artillery. If the Patriots tried to drive them from Boston Harbor, Howe's warships could bombard the city, or by firing carcasses, thin shells filled with flaming, oily rags, they could burn the city to the ground. The forces were deadlocked. Without cannons, the colonists couldn't liberate Boston. Without men, the British couldn't attack Cambridge. Both sides had spies in Boston, and Washington knew Howe was expecting reinforcements. Meanwhile, winter was here, and smallpox was creeping through the big camp. Some of the volunteers, sick, bored, lonesome for their families, were beginning to drift away. When the icy winds came with no victories to raise morale, the trickle of deserters would become a flood. Washington was afraid that his army, short of so many things, might fall apart, and with it, the whole precious cause. Here's another song I don't know the tune to. I'll have to just say the words. "I can't tell you half I saw, they kept up such a smother, so I tipped my hat, made a bow, and scampered home to mother." The squad, with its lone fifer, came straggling back to camp. Their cart held very little wood, since every tree, fence, and barn siding for miles had already been fed to the campfires. Slowly, the general walked back to his quarters. At the rate the army used it, firewood would soon be worth more than gold. Of course, the men needed fuel to stay warm. They also needed the fuel of success. His ragged soldiers needed a victory. Time was running out. Somehow the Continental Army had to work a miracle. If they could defeat Howe and set Boston free, it would electrify the colonies. That would put heart into the rebellion before it was too late. Or was it too late already? General Washington wasn't sure. Chapter 4, Paul and William. "You boy, come here!" The Marine raised his musket suspiciously. Paul turned and saw the redcoat. Quick as a hare, he vaulted a low wall and raced into a nearby alley. The soldier's heavy boots came pounding after him, but 15-year-old Paul Revere, Jr. knew the back routes and byways of Boston far better than any lobsterback. He had spent all afternoon fishing in Mill Cove, and he'd been lucky enough to land 2 plump fish. He wasn't about to let some British bully take them away. Hanging on to his precious catch, Paul turned a bend in the alley, dove through a hedge, and raced along a ditch. He cut to a weedy path behind Friend Street, circled Cockrell Church, and darted across Middle Street. And from there, another alley took him to North Square, where he stopped to catch his breath. The Marine had long since given up the chase, and Paul was able to cross the square and slip into the Revere house by the back way. He bolted the door, dropped his catch on the kitchen table, and leaned his fishbowl against the wall. Now he'd have a good dinner. But first there was something to attend to. He put one fish in a skillet. The other he wrapped in a scrap of paper and tucked inside his patched coat. He looked out the parlor window to make sure the coast was clear, and then hurried to Clark's Wharf. As far back as Paul could remember, his father had kept a workshop here on the wharf. In the old days, before the Troubles, Mr. Revere had been Boston's most successful craftsman. His workshop turned out beautiful silver pitchers, bowls, and tankards. He created surgeon's tools, copper engravings, serving spoons, eyeglass frames, handsome sword hilts, and even silver dog collars. And as a sideline, busy Mr. Revere acted as a dentist, pulling bad teeth out or making false ones of ivory and gold wire. Now, with his father branded a traitor by the British, the shop had been left in charge of a silversmith named Isaac Clemens. Since old Clemens was a Tory loyal to the king, the redcoats had left the shop alone. Paul Jr. didn't like Mr. Clements much. He didn't like anyone opposed to the cause. But the man was important to the family, so the boy thought a gift of food was a good idea. In Boston that winter, Tories got just as hungry as the Patriots. The gift was appreciated, and Clemens thanked Paul warmly. "Your father and I," the old man added, "don't agree on much these days, but I grant you, son, he's the best craftsman in the colonies. Send word to him, if you can, that old Clem is keeping a keen eye on everything." Back home, Paul fried his supper with the last of the stove wood and ate it slowly. There were no sounds in the empty house, and none outside except for the whining of a hungry dog and the pounding of the boots as a squad of soldiers marched by. Sitting there, Paul Jr. decided that being lonely was the worst of all feelings, even worse than being afraid. Under the hard thumb of the British, Boston was a town of ghosts and memories, shadow images that filled his thoughts in empty hours. As he cleaned up after his little meal, Paul remembered the good times before the warships came. North Square, where the Reveres lived, had been a bustling area, ringed with neat, prosperous houses. There were handsome trees, tidy gardens, shiny brass nameplates, elegant doorways, and fancy hitching posts for horses and carriages. And at the far end of the square was Old North Church, one of the finest in all of New England. 3 times a week, the square had become a grand town market where food of all kinds could be bought. Paul remembered the stalls piled high with fruits and farm vegetables, fat sacks of grain, and firkins of churned butter. Other booths had turkeys, hams, mutton and veal, quail and partridge, bags of flour and rye meal, kegs of oysters, tubs of pickled pork. Venison and bear steaks brought in by hunters, and lobsters were plentiful too, at a halfpenny each. Now it was all changed. The stalls were gone. So were most of the people who brought life and excitement to Paul's world. His father had helped to rouse the countryside at Lexington and Concord. Now he was hiding in Philadelphia and working with John Hancock, Sam Adams, and the other colonial leaders. His mothers and sisters and brothers had also fled, slipping away in a horse-drawn cart in the middle of the night. Only Paul remained at home, and for a reason. Many supporters of the rebellion had left everything behind when they escaped from Boston. To keep discipline, General Howe had decreed martial law. Thousands of people still lived in the besieged city, and the Marines had strict orders not to harm them. But empty, abandoned houses were looked upon as fair game. The redcoats looted these quickly, taking everything of value. They'd even ripped out doors, stairways, fine wood panels, and hand-carved railings to feed the campfires. The destruction was ongoing. Recently, the steeple of West Street Church had been pulled down for fuel. In Old South Church, the pews had been torn out and gravel spread over the floor, and now it served as a riding ring for General Burgoyne's fancy horses. Only one pew had been left in the church, and it had been turned into a pigsty. Because Paul still lived in the house, the Revere family home had been spared by the redcoats, but he felt their hatred and contempt. Now, sitting on his bed, the boy took a crumpled, stained piece of paper from his shirt pocket. It was a letter from his father that had been smuggled to him, and Paul read it over and over. In an artist's fine hand, Paul Revere Sr. had written, "My son, it is now in your power to be of service to me, your mother, and yourself. I beg you to keep yourself safely at home. Behave well. Attend to my business. Do not come away until I send you word. Your loving father, Paul Revere." Paul slipped the letter back into his pocket and frowned. He was dying to leave and join the rebels in Cambridge. He was old enough, well, almost, to be within the Continental Army and fight beside the other men, but he knew it was impossible. He had made a solemn promise to stay, and it was now his responsibility. In a way, he was like a soldier under orders, a soldier whose enemies were fear and loneliness. Unable to sleep, Paul paced the floor of his room. Plague take General William Howe. Plague take his warships. Plague take his cannons and his redcoats and his tap, 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 tap. Well, I'll have to stop here. You'll have to find out what all the tapping was about next time. Bye-bye.